Today, I will show you how to paint a pink pug using shades and tints of the color red. If you love learning about art, support this public school teacher side hustle and hit that subscribe button. I'm using a piece of watercolor paper, a high contrast black and white photograph of this pug, masking tape, and some graphite tracing paper. You can use carbon paper too, and you also don't have to trace. You can freehand it if drawing is your strong point, but many of my students feel intimidated by that. And since the focus on this is painting, we're gonna be using this graphite paper. As you can see, it transfers just like a pencil. Make sure you put it the right side down. We'll be transferring our image to focus more on the painting aspect. If you have done lots of drawing and painting before, you might not need this step, you might not need to trace, but I'm allowing my students that opportunity so we can just focus on the shades and the tints. My watercolor paper is taped to the table so it doesn't move, and the graphite paper needs to be graphite side down. So whichever side makes your finger dirty when you touch it, that needs to be touching the paper so your lines transfer. Then tape your photograph on top of that so that your lines that you trace over will transfer to the paper. Tape as much as you need to, and I recommend checking your work often, which is something I didn't do and regretted. You will see. Once you are all situated and you feel like your paper's not going to move around and you tested to see if the graphite works, then you're going to trace over your lines. You can use a pencil, but you want to use something that you can see what you have drawn. Sometimes if you use a pencil, it's hard to see like which lines you've done and which lines you haven't. So this red pen is a good solution to that. However, make sure you press down hard enough that you can truly get that graphite to work. Let's time lapse it here. I'm drawing over all the details that I can, including those areas of dark and light in the fur. And I'm giving my artwork a border since I don't want the pug to look like it was chopped in half and just floating around randomly. Okay, here's my fail. I'm gonna go ahead and take off the paper. I'm gonna go ahead and take off the graphite paper. And as you can see, I really didn't press down hard enough or check my work. I can see, but it'd be very difficult to see enough for painting. So what I'm gonna do is annoying, but very important. I'm gonna go back over my lines. And this is actually a good place to point out, it's kind of like a topographical map. So yes, I'm drawing all the details, but I'm also looking at shapes of value. So what I mean by that is where are the black areas? Where are the white areas? And then with your value scale, which we'll get out in a minute, where are your medium grays, your darkest grays, your lightest grays, and everything in between. My goal is to capture 6 shades and tints in combination. You could certainly do more, but I'm gonna focus on 3 shades, 3 tints, and of course I'll use pure black and white in the most high contrast areas. Let's speed things up again since I'm just retracing my lines. It will also have a paint by numbers vibe to it, which there's no shade to that. I actually think that's an excellent way to learn how to paint, to see color and value in that way. And speaking of color and value, here is my value scale that I'm gonna use for value mapping. If you have never done this before, click the link above and follow the steps. I had my students practice at least 4 colors. I'm doing red, and we're gonna start by mapping out the darkest values. So I'm gonna go down to my shades here, which is a base color mixed with black, and I'm finding the areas in my photograph. That's why a black and white high contrast photograph is important. And where are the areas that appear darkest or solid black? And I just kind of randomly categorize my values. I'm gonna say there's 4 total. So basically like the base color red, then my mediums, and then my darks. You can number that any way you want. And I like to kind of stick to shades first and then do tints. You can start with the lightest values too, but for this, I'm gonna start with my shades and my darkest values. So number 4 would be where it's darkest, and number 3 is where it's more medium to medium dark red. Let's start, and I'm not gonna use straight up black, but I'm gonna make a dark shade of black, or I'm sorry, a dark shade of red by adding a lot of black to my red, and I'm mixing that in a separate area. Testing out with a round brush, I'm gonna paint all the little areas that I marked as 4. You can do 1 value at a time. You can do all of your shades, all of your tints. It's better for my brain to kind of focus on like one thing at a time because your painting's gonna change a lot as you go. So basically, I'm just looking at the photograph and at my topographical map or paint by numbers map of this little pug here, and I'm filling in with this darkest shade. I can mix more shades as needed, and I will, although this isn't solid black, I am gonna add a few areas of solid black towards the end. I'm a big fan of high contrast, so I do want it to be natural. I want the shades to flow into each other and not be blocky, but there will be some areas that I want to stand out, and I will use pure black, but I'm going to save that a little bit more towards the end. So since I'm doing one shade at a time, I don't have to worry about washing my brush, and I'm referencing my photograph over and over again. So if you're freehanding this, definitely make sure you have a photograph to look at. And you could alter this in Photoshop, and you could make it like pink, because it is difficult. This is the easiest thing to do, would to be painting it grayscale, because then you don't have to translate in your mind, okay, what does dark red, how does that compare to darkest gray? And you have to kind of translate that in your brain. It is a really great learning exercise, but if you are very brand new to painting, grayscale is going to be the easiest way for you to approach this. Now, speaking of the photograph, I got this photograph at unsplash.com. And this is a fantastic resource for finding copyright-free images. Some of them you do have to pay for, but there's so many to choose from that you don't. And we want to respect all artists, including photographers, and not just steal other people's work. I will put in the description box the link to which photograph I used and the name of the artist. So if you go to the description box below, that info will be there for you. And what I'm moving on to now is more of the medium shades. So this would be kind of like between those level 2s and those level 3s. So if one is like base color red, and again, I'm not doing my tints yet, I'm staying on the darker shades of things. This is kind of that transitional value between black, or that darkest shade of red, and then where the tints and the base color red are going to be. One thing to keep in mind while painting is that acrylic paint is meant to be layered. So even if you put things a little clunky, or you put things a little bit overlapping in the wrong spot, you might even cover up some of your pencil lines. Use your eyes as reference, and you can overlap and make things darker, make things lighter, and change the shapes of things as you go. So you can see how this is a kind of dark burgundy color, and it's touching most of those darkest shades. Depending on your level of abilities or what photograph you've chosen, you might stay mostly in the shades category if your photograph is a little bit darker, or conversely, if you have lighter grays, you might stay more in the tints section of painting. So it really just depends on the photograph, and it depends on your goals. If I wanted just to do tints, so that darkest black or that darkest burgundy, I could just pretend and shift it, and I could make that just base color red, and then do the rest of the lighter values as tints. You can also use editing things, like you can edit this on your phone. You can even edit this as like a Word document. I said editing things. You can use editing software, apps. You can edit your photograph to also show different ranges of shades or tints depending on what your goals are. So now what I'm gonna do is, as you see, I'm putting the number 1. I'm finding those areas that kind of look medium gray. And so if medium gray is the cutoff point for shades, and then I'll do tints for those lightest areas. And there really are fewer tints than shades, which again, as you heard me say, I can adjust. So with this red here, what I'm basically going to do is cover up almost all of the remaining white space. The reason why is I then will go back on top of those areas and find the tints and just kind of overlap from there. This brand of paint is a little thin, so I can still see my pencil marks, and also you could either redraw them if you covered them up, or you could just paint them instead of draw them. So again, it all depends on your level as an artist. Now, if you're ever interested in doing an underpainting, another thing I could do is I could have painted this entire piece of paper red, then trace my pug on top of it, and then I have my baseline already covered. But since this is a beginner exercise of shades and tints, I took the whole underpainting concept out of it, and it's simply looking for those areas of light and looking for those areas of dark. And you can see the pug is really starting to come to life with just these 3 shades already: red, dark red, and then a shade that's almost black. Let's time lapse it here, since most of this area is going to be red. Okay, now for mixing my first tint, which is going to be the darkest tint on here. So still leaning heavy towards red. With a clean brush, I'm gonna scoop a little bit of white, and then I'm gonna transform this red into my first pink. You can play around with how much white to add. You can add more red or whatever base color you're using, because you certainly don't have to do red just because I am. And then I'm gonna fill in the areas that are lighter than that base gray. So I'm looking for the lightest grays on here. This is going to be mostly the highlights, the areas that kind of protrude from the dog's face, like the ear that sticks out more, or the part of the eye. And I am going to kind of build it up in a way that's a little bit clunky, so you can see this isn't blending into that red. But remember, there's going to be so much blending and going back and overlapping with your color. Using acrylic paint is all about, overlapping, letting things dry and then coming back to it. It's not really like watercolor. I mean, yeah, I am blending wet on wet. That is definitely an option. But there is a lot of like letting things dry and then going back in. Let's double time here, since this is a repeat of what you've seen me do before, with the exception of kind of overlapping over the red. And I am, although you can't see in the frame, I am referencing the photograph a lot. I'm using my trained eye to find these lighter values. And again, these aren't the lightest, but they're on the lighter scale of things. Still looking at my monochromatic shades and tints of red, which again, if you haven't practiced that first, that is absolutely the first step. It's like not warming up before playing a game. If you're a sports person, an athlete, you know how important it is. You would never sing in a concert without warming up your voice. It's the same concept. Let's go a little bit lighter here. And so I'm mixing white into that same little area of tints. And now I'm looking for areas that are the lightest, not pure white like in the eyes or that cute little white spot on the pug's neck, but the areas that are almost that light. So you can see there's some fur sticking out on the side, definitely the nose and the downturned little smash looking mouth. And then just any area that has a highlight, like on the on the right hand side of the pug, there's some lighter fur that I'll be using this tint as well. Let's double time here. So this is a really great exercise for seeing value, because using value in your painting will make something appear to be three-dimensional and have form. This is just a photograph. If you touch it, it's flat and it's just a painting, but it looks like it's three-dimensional because all of the areas of shadow and light. Do I paint like this? No. So this would be a really great learning exercise. And I remember as a high school student, we did this and just it clicking in my brain like, oh, that's how you make something look 3D with paint. And although it has like a paint by numbers look at first, it really is such a great way to force your brain to see things in shapes that are values of color. And that's kind of complicated because you have to first think about color, which is challenging. Then you have to think about value, areas of lights and darks, and how do those shapes of those things all interact together to make a painting that looks lifelike, or at least looks three-dimensional. So again, I can now, because I have more training, I can go out and paint something and just look at it and my mind can kind of capture these areas of light and dark. So practice always makes better. So I actually don't paint from photographs if I can help it. This is a great learning tool, but I like to draw and paint from life if possible. But it's such a great way to train your eye to see these things. Speaking of training your eye, let's get some of these lighter values in the pug's eye here and that adorable little white spot on the pug. I am reaching the point where I'm going to use pure white in certain areas, so then I can key it with that lightest tint. So the nose is not white. Look at how different that white value is in the pug's eye compared to the lightest tint in the pug's nose. So that's why it's important to kind of get that lightest value on there first, and then you can key it just like you would tune a guitar or tune a piano to kind of match and have the same key. So this light spot sticking out is not white, but it's that lightest tint that gives the pug some dimension. And so I'm just going to kind of go back over those lightest areas that I painted and make them a little bit lighter, but not pure white. You may also notice I'm using a teeny tiny brush, and I'm finally starting to think a little bit about texture. So before I was just kind of getting the base colors and tints and shades in, and now I'm thinking texture. So what would this part of the dog look like? So how can I make it look more of a furry texture? How does like the soft little part of the nose differ between the fur on the chin of the dog versus the fur on the shoulder of the dog and all that stuff. So now I'm thinking a little bit more detail oriented, which is my favorite part. And this tiny little paintbrush is doing really great for adding those like little white whiskers in the chin and all of that nice detail. Now you can see it's still a little off, and I always tell my students you can't judge a painting until it's done. Like I'm missing the darker version of that, which I'm going in and doing now. And so if you look at a painting and judge it before it's done, it's like if you're, I don't know, doing your makeup, which I know not everyone can relate to that, you know, or all those people on YouTube that like do the contouring and they draw it in, which by the way, how do you look like a real person walking around like that? But that's another subject. You know, before you blend it all together, it looks weird. It looks blocky. And so it's kind of the same concept. Never judge a painting until it's finished. So I have pure black on my brush, which is a little bit of a risk because this is kind of that darkest burgundy, and now I'm playing around with using pure black instead. So I have a feeling I'm gonna have to kind of do that, and I don't want it to look like a catfish with whiskers, or I don't want it to look like I have all this development of value and then I just draw 2 lines for the mouth. Really pay attention if you have a dark value. It's probably closer to another value that's not quite as dark. So try to avoid outlines. There's very few things in the natural world that is a direct outline. And look at shapes, look at value, and then look at color, which we simplified it by just using one color. I'm going to not follow my own advice here and draw these lines for this adorable little dog face, and it kind of makes it look like he has a mustache, which I'm not going to panic. It might look weird now, but I know I'm going to come back to it. One thing that I advise you not to do is save the background for last. This isn't last, but I probably should have mapped this in a little bit earlier. So many times young artists will think of the background as an afterthought. And your positive space, the subject, and the negative space, the background, they cannot work without each other. So don't leave the background for last. Really consider what the background is going to have included and how it's going to not take away from your subject, but how it's going to naturally enhance it. And this is easy because I know I'm going to use a tint because the photograph is white in the background. Now, I edited this photograph, so if you go to unsplash.com and use this, I did bump the contrast because I wanted clear values for my students to see, but in turn, it took away some of that beautiful detail in the background. I'm just gonna make it up. Basically, I want my dog to look like a saint, so I'm gonna do like a little halo around the dog's head and then just gradually kind of fade out to a darker value. I'm gonna keep this really light though. Most of my tints are gonna be found in this background. And the reason why is the dog is really dark in the photograph, and I do wanna still kind of capture that. You could do an opposite color in the background. The background could be gray, you could do a pattern. It really just depends on your goals. Since this is all about seeing value and shades and tints of one color, I'm gonna stick to that, but I always encourage my students to think of what the background can, do to further enhance your subject. And what you see me doing here, which is a little different than how I painted the dog, is I'm doing more of a wet on wet technique. And so you saw I put that darker tint of pink, and then I'm taking a brush and pulling that into the lighter tint, and I'm letting it all blend and mix on the paper. I've painted a lot, so I feel very natural doing that. If that stresses you out, you can pre-mix your tints and your shades just like you did in the subject. But for me, I'm just kind of having fun. I know I want a circular kind of orb of light where it goes lighter around the pug and then fades to darker in the background. Now that I have procrastinated, I'm gonna go back and kind of touch up the weird parts of the dog's face. So let me put just a little bit more light in the background. I'm gonna let that dry, and I will come back to it at least one more time. And now that I'm thinking lighter, I'm gonna get those lighter tints in the dog's mouth to kind of tone down that thicker black line that I added. So again, this is kind of covering up some work I've already done. I'm just double checking and making sure that those lighter tints are in play and that they have their voice. And now that I have my background, it really starts to create harmony and unity within my tints. Now I'm going to progress to my base red, and I'm going to take that and meet some of those lighter tints to the more medium base color of red. So I could do this with my darkest tint, which is kind of like a pink, but I'm just taking that red to kind of touch up any area that just looks a little bit awkward or a little bit overturned. And then this will give the dog kind of that red unity. So basically my next steps are keying everything together. Just like a guitar, I've used this example before, you would tune it to make sure it's in harmony with itself. I'm just going back and double checking to make sure the shapes are right, that the values are in the right spot, and that there's no like weird blotchy area. I'm still thinking tint, so I'm going back to that darkest tint somewhere between red and that lightest one. And now I'm thinking again texture, so I'm putting small little areas with small little brush strokes to give it that fur-like texture and to just create the shapes that I want. So this is kind of the tightening up process, especially in the dog's face. I could probably, not be as accurate in the fur because it's cut off luckily at the point where I don't have to worry about legs or things like that. And so, your dog might have a different pattern on it, or the light might be hitting it a different way, and that gives me a little bit more flexibility in that regard. That is a lighter area, so I want to make sure I don't neglect it, and I want to really think about edges, like where does the edge of the mouth touch the shadow into the body of the dog or the background. The ears kind of disappeared a little bit, and so it's all about finding those small details and really tightening them up. I did not have the luxury of doing that with this work of art, but what I suggest is walking away for at least a day. So finding a stopping point, hanging it up, and coming back to it with fresh eyes is super important. And then you can really see those details. You can see that I'm doing more overlapping in the eyes and the mouth because, it's a portrait of a dog. So you want the dog's face to really be the most developed part. Now, you want to develop all the parts, of course, but neglecting the face of the dog would be a mistake. So in a perfect world, I would have had time to stop, hang it up, come back to it after getting a night's sleep or doing something different, because you see so many different things when you take some time away. Also, I've been staring at this dog's face for quite a while. This video is going to be short compared to the footage that I have. I probably have like 3 hours worth of footage. You'll see 25 minutes if I get to my goal editing. We'll just have to see how much I'm going to cut. And so another trick is to ask a friend to hold it up to them and look at it from a distance and ask them to compare it to the photograph and give you feedback. You can't let your feelings get hurt when you get feedback like that, but it's a really great way to get feedback from someone other than yourself. And I'm taking the same small brush and again, just focusing on those details, the lights, the darks, and everything in between to really make sure my pug comes to life. He really has this like old man, little squishy face, and I have some edges that are a little bit wonky, and so I'm just going to be using a variety of size brushes to go in and get those details. And it's just a lot of looking at the image and referencing it and really trying your best to find those areas of light and dark, especially paying attention to the edges and getting the overall shape of everything right. I'm going to stop here and just let you watch me paint. It's the same thing over and over again. I don't want to edit out the most important details, so just kind of watch me go. And then at the end, we'll talk about the final steps. That I've obsessed about the face a little bit more. Let's procrastinate and go to the background. It's dried a little bit, so you can see that white circle is much more contrasting. And I want it to be circular. I want it to be somewhat even, like my dog is in a spotlight or haloed, because it's just a perfect little pug angel. And so I'm using a brush, just mixing that lighter value to blend into the background. It's pretty dry, might be a little bit tacky, but pretty much dry here. And I am adding some more white lines to give it just a little bit more detail. And then I'm going in with that pink here. Feeling done, even though I never feel done. That is how you paint a pug using shades and tints of red. Thank you so much for sticking around and making art with me. And if you're interested in what my students are up to in my classroom, find me on Instagram at thatartteacher_Machado and find my website at thatartteacher.com for my full-length lesson plans and student examples, all for free.